Let's sew a quick and easy beginner quilt block. Hi, my name is Fallon and today I would like to sew the double 4-patch quilt block with you. I recently shared a video tutorial on my channel with 5 different beginner quilt blocks. And the 4-patch quilt block was a block featured in that video. This 4-patch block is the foundation for the double 4-patch block. The 4-patch block is one of the oldest known quilt block patterns. How cool is that? And because of that, it is considered one of the earliest forms of patchwork. The 4-patch quilt block is really easy to master. And because of that, it was often the first quilt block taught to children who are learning how to sew. I really love the 4-patch block because once you master this quilt block, you can use that as a foundation to sew more complicated quilt blocks. So you can see here on this quilt that it looks like a pretty complicated quilt. Right here in the center of this block is a 4-patch block that was the foundation of one of the blocks in this quilt. Now here is another quilt that uses the 4-patch block twice. So you can see here that the 4-patch block is in the center of this sawtooth star block, but it is also in the center of this square in the square block. And here is another quilt that has a 4-patch block in it. So you can find the 4-patch block over here, and it is part of a 9-patch block. So now you can see how the simple 4-patch quilt block can help you make some more complex quilts. But I think a good transition after learning to sew a simple 4-patch block is to learn how to make a double 4-patch quilt block. So let's make it. So here is the layout for a double 4-patch block. Now let's talk about the different cuts of fabric you will need to create this block. So you can really use any colorway you would like, but when I make a double 4-patch, I like for my larger blocks to be kind of a medium fabric. Then I like some of my 4 patches to be a light fabric, and then I like a really dark fabric as well. So to sew up this block, you will need 2 larger squares that are 4.5 inches, and then you will need 4 light squares that are 2.5 inches, and 4 dark squares that are also 2.5 inches. Now, when I'm making a patchwork pattern like the 4-patch, I really like to cut out all my squares and sew them together. But you can also strip piece these squares if you would like, and some people do feel that that is a little bit easier. So let me show you that first before bringing the block together, just in case it is a method that you would like to use. So you will take 2 strips of fabric. A jelly roll here works really well, and you will have it 2.5 inches wide by whatever length you are working with. So if you're using a jelly roll strip, it'll be 2.5 inches by your width of fabric. So I have one that is a darker strip and one that is my light strip. And then you'll just place those right sides together and sew a 1/4 inch seam. So I have them right sides together and lined up as best as I can. And then I'm just going to sew a 1/4 inch seam across the edge. And then I like to finger press this seam with my fingers first, just to get the seam moving in the direction I would like. And here I'm choosing to press the seam toward the darker fabric. All right, and once I get the seam moving in the direction that I want it to go, I'm going to use my iron to press this seam and set it really nice. All right, so once that seam is pressed really well, I can cut it into 2.5-inch segments. So let me show you how to do that. So the first thing I like to do is line up one of the edges on a line on my mat. And then I'm going to use some lines going vertical to trim off a straight edge. So once I have a straight edge, I'm going to use one of my lined rulers and I'm going to line up the 2.5-inch mark on the edge of that cut line that I had there. And what's really nice here as well is that there are lines going in the other direction. So I can line them up on my seam that I sewed and on the bottom of the fabric and up here to make sure that I'm lined up nice and straight. So I have 2.5 inches here. And then I'm just going to cut. And so I have one segment here that I can use to make my 4 patch. I'm going to cut one more and then I'll show you how to bring it together. So I need one more segment to be able to sew a 4 patch. But if I were making a few 4 patches, I would just keep on cutting these segments until I get as many as I can out of this strip set. All right, so I have 2 segments here and you can see they would have been lined up like this and cut. But to make the 4 patch, I am going to turn it to get that patchwork design. And since we have the seams pressed toward the darker fabric in both cases, you can see that one is pressed up this way and one is pressed down that way, and that will help these lay nicely together. So the seams are what we call nested, so they're going in opposite directions and you won't have a lot of fabric bulked up there, and you can kind of just feel these come together like a puzzle piece and you'll get a really nice point with that. So I'm going to hold them together and sew a 1/4-inch seam across here. If you would like, definitely put some pins in if you feel more comfortable with that. All right, so there is our 4 patch. See, you have a nice point there. I'm just going to finger press the seam. And then, of course, we will press it with the iron to get it nice and flat. And there we go. We have our beautiful 4 patch block. Now, here's where I really want to show you why I like to cut out all of my squares individually and bring them together. This here is a beautiful 4 patch block. However, if you look at it, you can see that this design on here is directional. And you have some of these beautiful flowers that are upside down here and some that are right side up. And oftentimes that's okay for me. I don't mind that happening, but if you would really like a lot of control in your block, then cutting them out individually and bringing all of the squares together will work really well if you want a certain design element to your block. With these cut out, I can keep all of the flowers going upright with absolute ease. I won't have any that are upside down. Now, if you don't have any directional fabric, then doing the strip piecing will work really well also. So here's how I bring the 4 patch together if I'm just using 2.5-inch squares. So I'll take the first 2 2.5-inch squares, lay them right sides together, and also a 1/4-inch seam. And because these were laid out on my design board, I have them laying in the direction I want them to be already. So when I bring them up here to sew, I keep them in that layout and I'm able to just chain piece these together and it'll keep the block in the layout that I wanted. So here you can see my flowers are both facing upright. And since I didn't cut that thread, they are held together here. So I won't lose the layout that I wanted. Now I'm going to finger press this seam at the top of the 4 patch toward the darker fabric. And then I'm going to press this bottom segment here to the darker fabric as well. And now I'm just going to press the seam with my iron. So it's pressed nice and flat, and then I'm going to bring it together just like I did those strip segments before. I'm going to lay this right sides together. I'm going to feel that those seams are nice and nested together. And then I'll just sew a 1/4 inch seam across there. All right, and I'm going to finger press that seam. Got a nice point there. And I'll press it with the iron to get it nice and flat. All right, and so now we have one of the 4 patches finished, and we just have one more to bring together in that same manner. All right, so I'm going to sew the first 2 squares together. And then I didn't cut the thread, and I'm going to sew the next 2. And I'm just going to sew them together just like they were in my layout. So fold that right sides together. And you can see that there's different fabrics on top here. I have my lighter fabric on top in the first set, and then the darker fabric is on top in the second. Then I'm going to finger press the seams. Here I'm always pressing the seam toward the darker fabric. Okay, and then I'm going to press that with the iron. And then again, that thread's holding them together. I can see the layout is perfect, just how I wanted. The flowers are all facing up. And then I'm just going to fold this right sides together. I'm going to make sure that those seams are nested together. I can feel it's nice and flat and the seams are meeting up perfect. And then I'll sew a 1/4 inch seam. All right, I'm going to finger press that over. Look how nicely these seams have been meeting. Press with some heat. All right, so that is laying nice and flat. The points are coming together beautifully. And so now we can bring the double 4 patch block together. We have all of our prep work done, which was making the 4 patches. And so now you can see why it's called a double 4 patch. We have these 2 smaller 4 patch segments, but we're bringing them together with these larger blocks to make a double 4 patch. So I'm going to sew the first row of the 4 patch together, and that's taking one of my smaller 4 patch segments with that 4.5 inch square. And I'm going to make sure that my directional fabric is all facing up. Lay it right sides together, and I'm just going to sew a 1/4 inch seam. And just like with the smaller 4 patch, I'm going to not cut my thread as I sew, and I'm going to start sewing the second row together. Now, something I forgot to mention to you is that you can measure your smaller 4 patches and make sure that they are the correct size. If you need to, you may need to trim them down. They should measure out to 4.5 inches, just like the larger square here. All right, so I'm going to lay this right sides together. I made sure my directional fabric was all facing up. Line it up nicely, and I'm just going to sew a 1/4 inch seam. And just like before, you can see on the top one, my full square, the 4.5 inch square is on top, and on the second one, my 4 patch is on top. All right, and so here for ease of pressing, we're going to press the seam toward the larger full square here. And that's just because it's going to reduce a lot of bulk here. And if we do that on both rows, we're also going to be able to nest the seam so we get some nice points again. So I'm finger pressing toward the full square on both of these rows, and then I'm going to press the seam. All right, and so now we just have one more seam to sew. We're going to lay this right sides together. Make sure that our seams nest here since they're both pressed toward that full patchwork square. Since they're both pressed toward the full square, we are able to nest the seam nicely. So I'm just going to sew a 1/4 inch seam across here. And again, if you feel more comfortable adding pins in here, go ahead and do that. Right, and we have just one more seam to press. All right, and so here it is, the beautiful double 4 patch block. This block measures out to an 8.5 inch square, unfinished, so it will be an 8 inch square finished. Isn't it just a fun block to sew? It is so easy, and if you have mastered the 4 patch block, you will easily be able to make this double 4 patch block. Now in the description of this video, I will link to the video where I shared how to make the 4 patch block along with 4 other beginner friendly blocks. And I will also link to the tutorials of the quilts I showed earlier. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.